Yo, Aston here, bringing you another Ableton Live tutorial. This time focusing on getting your loops, samples, and everything else in between to sound a little bit more human and more real. Let's get into it. Alrighty, so just before I start, as you might hear, it's a little bit reverby in the back. Only half of it at the moment has been treated, so you might hear a bit of an echo in the back, so hopefully I'll be able to get that sorted soon so we won't have to deal with that in the future. Now, what we're going to focus on is basically making your sounds, so when you're going in and making MIDI clips with samples and all that sort of stuff, you can go through and change the velocities and, change your groove and all that sort of stuff to make it sound a little bit more human. What I want to do today is actually show you another way that you can do that using a pretty useful tool called LFO. Now, I'm not sure if all the packages actually come with that in Ableton Live. I definitely know that Suite does. Now, when you have Max for Live, there's a bunch of different effects and stuff that you can download, audio effects, instruments, MIDI effects, all that sort of stuff. But LFO is the one that we're going to be focusing on today, and the majority of what we're going to be doing is actually automating a lot of different things in Ableton, so you don't actually have to, well, I wouldn't say automating, but instead of you having to physically type things in or turn the velocity up on every note inside of a MIDI clip, what we're going to actually be doing is having this do it in the background by setting a few things up in the first place. So to start with, I've got, I'll show you a few different ways that we're going to do this, some with audio channels and some with MIDI. Now for starters, I've made one which is the idea behind it is trying to make it sound like a real clap. So if you've got a bunch of people clapping in a room, it's kind of hard to rectify, it's kind of hard to do that in Ableton and make it sound more human. So what we're going to do is grab a bunch of samples, like I've laid it out here. So this is what it sounds like at the moment. It's just no automation, no nothing on it. It's just a pattern of claps. So that sounds a little bit robotic. Now I've moved the clips themselves and the notes just to make them so they're a little bit off, so they hit at different times, but it still sounds a little bit robotic because there's no change in volume. Like when you're doing it in real life, there's obviously different sample parts hitting, there's different, it's not the exact same sample that you're hearing every time. So what we're gonna do is actually change that a little bit to make it so that it's automating it. So for starters, I've got a drum rack open with these claps. I'm only using these 3 at the moment. Now what we're going to do is inside drum rack, we're going to drag an LFO into each sample. So you can do it on the main channel, which will affect them all. But what we're going to be doing is affecting each sample individually. So you'll have an LFO, put them on. I've got a couple on at the moment, and I'll show you why in a second. So we'll start off with this one. Right. That one's this pattern. Now what we're going to do is turn on the LFO, and when you first go into it, it'll be a button called map, and what we're going to do is map that to the volume of the sample. Now before you press play or anything, make sure that you turn down the offset and the depth a little bit, because otherwise it's going to, I'll show you what it does. If the depth is all the way turned up, it's going to erratically go really loud and really quiet, and you don't want that because you're going to go deaf. So what we're going to do is turn down the depth, turn down the offset. And what I like to do is change the wave to random. Now that means that it's going to be playing at a completely random time. It's not going to play the same section twice or the same loudness twice. It's just going to be completely random. And to make that sound a little bit better, I've turned up the smoothness and the jitter a little bit, because the jitter can sometimes make the sample sound a little bit funny. But it also just makes it feel a little bit more natural. So this is what we get now. Now you can play around with the depth and the offset a little bit if you want it to be a little bit louder. Basically, if you turn up the depth, it means it gives it more of a span, more of an area to actually turn up. And the offset is basically from where that point you want it to start on the volume. So if we turn up the depth, it's going to have more of an area. But if we turn up the offset, it means it's going to sit between a higher point. So you can have a play around with those yourself and find a nice little spot that you like it. But basically at the moment it is doing exactly the same as what you would do if you sat here in Ableton and turned up the velocities individually on every note, just making it quieter and louder. But what this is doing is actually making it so that at random times it's going to be a completely different pattern every single time. Now what you can do with that is if you find a pattern, you're only doing it on one sample, you find a little pattern, you can record it for, a few minutes into an audio track, and then you can pick the ones that you like. So, okay, if you find a little bit where it, might go up loud and then go a little bit quiet again, you're like, all right, I want to loop that. You can record that, copy that in, and then you've got yourself a clap loop. Now I've done that with all of these here. So if I turn on the LFO on all of them, this is what it's going to sound like. So it's sounding a little bit better straight away. It's giving it a bit more movement. Now the other thing I like to do is put another LFO on each one and actually affect the panning. So that way it gives it a little bit more movement around the stereo image, and it helps it to sound a little bit more real. So turning on all of those LFOs. As you'll see in the controls, these ones are now mapped to the pan. And you can have the depth the whole way up if you want it to go really left and really right. Put a bit of reverb on there, see what it sounds like. Now you're not going to get it exact to what it would sound like as a real person clapping, but it's the closest that you're going to get in Ableton using just samples. Now another thing that you can do, which can also help that as well, is if you wanted to do that with just one sample, there's a handy little trick that you can do by dragging in another LFO there. And what we're going to do is actually map. So with this in the sample, in the simpler I think it's called, you've got the classic, one shot and slice. Now for this to work, generally it works better when you do it in classic. You can turn the release the whole way up. And what we're going to do is actually map the LFO to the start of the sample. So that way, every time that it's hitting, it's going to be a different section of the sample. So it's almost going to sound like it's a different sample every time. Now with this one that you need to actually play around with the offset a bit more, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of dead noise and it's going to be a really quiet sample. This is what it sounds like at the moment before I've changed any of the waves, the rates or anything like that. So what I like to do, you don't need to move this up too much because otherwise it's going to cut a lot of the sample. And your offset so it's closer to the start. Move the depth so it has a little bit more area to do it in. And make sure the release is turned up all the way so that it's not cutting the sample. So basically every single time this pattern is played, a different section of that sample is getting hit. You can do that with all of these as well, and this is what you'll get. Again, turn up the smoothness so it doesn't do it as jolty. You can have the smoothness down if you like, it's completely up to you. This is what we get. So at every single point that one of these hits, it's going to play a different part of the sample every single time. So it just gives it a bit more of a human feel that you might hear a few different people clapping in the background. You can play around with effects and delays and all that sort of stuff and actually get it to sound like it's closer. But yeah, that's basically how you would do it with claps. And yeah, you could do that with a lot of different types of samples as well. Now I've got another way that we're going to do it with hats. Now this one I've just drawn in a pattern. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to drag in an LFO, we're going to map it to the volume, make sure the depth and the offset is turned down so we don't kill our ears. You can have it at random, you can have it at a sine wave so it sounds a little bit more in the rhythm of your music. And that's just a quick way, instead of having to go in and change the velocity to them all to give them a different pattern. Alright, another way that you can use the LFO tool with randomizing is actually, so doing the same thing that we did there, but instead of drawing in the pattern, what we're going to do is put an arpeggiator onto it, like so, and this is what it'll sound like, same thing. You can turn up the rate, you can turn it down. And what we're going to do with this one is you can do the same thing that I just did there, control the volume, What I like to do as well to make samples sound a little bit more interesting is actually map the rate. Now, you'll see what I mean by this. Turn down the depth so it doesn't go as far. Maybe you want to move the offset forward. Do the same thing, map the volume. Turn up the rate a little bit if you like. It's doing it, that means that the wave is moving quicker. So maybe together with the claps. Again, you can do the same thing as before. You can automate or do an LFO on the panning. You can do it on the volume. You can do it on, a multitude of different things. Now, the last one I'm going to show you is on a loop on I've got a shaker loop in here. So this is what it sounds like at the moment. Now, it's already a nice loop, but what we're going to do is just give that a little bit of our own touch on it. Now, instead of using in a sample or in a pregiator or anything like that, we've just got the straight loop. So what we're going to do is actually open up a gate to be able to control this one. And with the gate, we're going to actually map the threshold of the gate to the sample. And what we're going to do is, again, play around with the depth, with the offset, so it gets to a good point on the gate that we can actually control it. So this is what it sounds like now. So the random wave, smoothness is turned up. Found a good offset to where it sits nicely. And what I like to do is actually automate and play around with the release. So imagine when your song's building up, you want to add a little bit more of a build. Release on and drop back. Now, if you want, you could also put another LFO in. You can map it with the same settings. I generally wouldn't map it something else on it with the same settings that you've got on here, because it doesn't give you much leeway to be able to play around with the depth and the offset and all that sort of stuff. So generally, I would open up another LFO, map that to the release, and then, that way it's having a bit of a play around. As you can see, release is moving. And put the offset back a little bit. Yeah, but generally I like to automate that one myself, so I'll go into the automation lane and actually build an ebb and flow with that one. But that's it. So that's a few good ways that you can use the LFO tool to be able to automate a few different things and help keep your music sounding a little bit more interesting and changing it up to make it sound a little bit more humanized. So, thank you very much for watching. Like, subscribe, do all that, and we'll see you on the next one.